My name is Natalie Brooks, and I'm 28 years old. Last Christmas Eve, my family screamed at me that they wished I would disappear forever. 24 hours later, they lost $2.5 million because I made that wish come true. I'm a financial consultant, and I had just discovered that my own mother, stepfather, and brother had been forging my signature on fraudulent loan documents for over 2 years. When I confronted them during our family dinner, they didn't deny it. Instead, they attacked me, called me ungrateful, and told me I should vanish from their lives. So I did exactly that, taking all the evidence with me. Before we dive into this story of betrayal and justice, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible true stories. Trust me, you won't believe how this family's greed led to their complete downfall. Let's get started. The story really begins 18 months before that explosive Christmas Eve dinner. I had been working as the unofficial financial advisor for Brooks Family Holdings, which was essentially a collection of properties and investments that my family had accumulated over the years. My mother, Charlotte, who was 55 at the time, had remarried Gerald Patterson when I was 26. Gerald was 58, charming, and seemed to genuinely care about our family's financial future. At first, I was grateful to have someone who understood business helping us navigate our finances. My role started innocently enough. Gerald would ask me to review contracts, explain financial terms to my mother, and occasionally use my professional credentials to help secure better loan terms for family investments. As a licensed financial consultant with a clean record and strong credit score, I could often get us access to deals that wouldn't have been available otherwise. I thought I was helping my family build wealth and security. I had no idea I was actually helping them commit systematic fraud. The first red flag appeared about 6 months into Gerald's involvement with our finances. I was reviewing some paperwork for a property acquisition when I noticed that my signature appeared on documents I had never seen before. When I asked Gerald about it, he explained that Charlotte had signed on my behalf because I had been out of town. He showed me a power of attorney document that I supposedly had signed, giving my mother permission to handle my financial affairs. The signature looked close enough to mine that I questioned my own memory. Maybe I had signed it and forgotten during a particularly busy period at work. My brother Tyler, who was 31 and worked in real estate, seemed completely supportive of Gerald's initiatives. He would often praise Gerald's business acumen and suggest that I was being unnecessarily cautious about our family's ventures. Tyler had always been closer to our mother than I was, and after our father died when we were teenagers, he had taken on the role of protector and decision-maker for the family. When Gerald came along, Tyler seemed relieved to hand over that responsibility to someone with more experience. The family dynamics became increasingly uncomfortable as Gerald consolidated his control over our finances. During family dinners, conversations would revolve around new investment opportunities, property acquisitions, and business strategies that I wasn't consulted on despite being the only one with professional financial training. When I tried to offer input or ask questions about the source of funding for these ventures, I was told that I was being negative or that I didn't understand the bigger picture. Charlotte began treating me more like an employee than a daughter. She would call me at work to ask me to review documents on short notice, often for deals that were supposedly time-sensitive. When I couldn't drop everything to accommodate these requests, she would become cold and distant, making comments about how I was putting my job before my family. The emotional manipulation was subtle but constant, creating an environment where questioning Gerald's decisions felt like betraying the family. The isolation tactics became more sophisticated over time. Important family meetings about business decisions would happen without me, and I would only learn about major acquisitions or financial commitments after they were already finalized. When I expressed frustration about being left out of decisions that affected my professional reputation, since my name was often on the paperwork, Gerald would explain that they hadn't wanted to burden me with details since I was so busy with my own career. Looking back, I can see how carefully orchestrated this manipulation was. Gerald needed my credentials and clean financial record to access legitimate funding, but he also needed to keep me isolated from the details of how that funding was being obtained and used. By creating an environment where asking questions was seen as disloyalty and where my expertise was simultaneously essential and dismissed, he managed to use me as an unwitting accomplice in increasingly elaborate fraud schemes. The red flags multiplied throughout that first year. Properties were purchased under company names I had never heard of, yet somehow my signature appeared on all the loan documents. Financial statements showed assets and income that didn't match what I knew about our family's actual financial situation. When I tried to investigate these discrepancies, I was told that Gerald had restructured everything to optimize our tax situation and that I shouldn't worry about details that were above my pay grade. The Christmas Eve that changed everything started like any other family holiday. Charlotte had spent days preparing an elaborate dinner at the family mansion, a sprawling colonial-style home that Gerald had purchased the previous spring using what he claimed were proceeds from a successful business venture. The house was decorated with expensive ornaments and fresh garland, creating the perfect backdrop for what should have been a joyful family celebration. I arrived at 6 in the evening, carrying gifts and trying to push down the growing unease I had been feeling about our family's financial situation. Tyler was already there with his girlfriend Hannah, and several cousins and aunts had been invited to join us for the extended family gathering. The atmosphere seemed festive enough, with Christmas music playing and the smell of roast beef filling the air. The first sign of trouble came when I noticed Gerald working on his laptop in the study, even though we had agreed that Christmas Eve would be device-free. When I walked past the open door, I glimpsed what looked like banking websites and financial documents on his screen. More troubling, I could see my name and what appeared to be my signature on several of the documents he was reviewing. I waited for an appropriate moment and then approached Gerald privately, asking if we could discuss some business matters after dinner. He immediately became defensive, closing his laptop and telling me that he was just handling some routine year-end paperwork that couldn't wait. When I mentioned that I had seen my name on some of the documents, his demeanor shifted completely. The charming, paternal figure I had known for the past 18 months suddenly became cold and calculating. Gerald accused me of spying on him and questioned my motives for being so interested in family business that didn't directly concern me. He suggested that my recent questions about our finances indicated that I was becoming paranoid and possibly jealous of the family's success. The conversation quickly escalated from a simple inquiry into a full-scale confrontation about my role in the family and my attitude toward the financial decisions he had been making. Charlotte walked in during the middle of this exchange and immediately sided with Gerald without even asking what the discussion was about. She accused me of being ungrateful for everything Gerald had done for our family and suggested that my constant questions and concerns were creating unnecessary stress during what should be a peaceful holiday celebration. Her immediate defense of Gerald, without any consideration for my perspective, felt like a betrayal that cut deeper than any financial irregularity. The situation deteriorated rapidly once we sat down for dinner. Gerald had apparently briefed the other family members about our earlier confrontation because several of my cousins began making pointed comments about how some people couldn't just enjoy family time without creating drama. Tyler, who I had hoped would support me, instead launched into a speech about how Gerald had brought stability and prosperity to our family and how ungrateful it was for anyone to question his methods or motives. When I tried to explain my concerns about the documents I had seen, Gerald interrupted me and announced to the entire table that I had been going through his private papers and questioning his integrity. He painted the situation as if I was the aggressor, suggesting that my behavior indicated serious character flaws and possibly mental health issues. The other family members immediately rallied to his defense, treating me as if I was having some kind of breakdown rather than raising legitimate business concerns. The attack became more personal and vicious as the evening progressed. Charlotte stood up and delivered a monologue about how disappointed she was in the daughter she had raised, claiming that I had become selfish and suspicious since starting my career. She suggested that my professional success had gone to my head and that I now thought I was better than the rest of the family. Tyler added his own criticisms, revealing that he had been reporting my concerns to Gerald and Charlotte for months, painting me as someone who was trying to undermine family unity. The extended family members joined in the assault, with my Aunt Teresa calling me a family destroyer and my cousin Mitchell suggesting that I was probably embezzling money from my own clients if I was so paranoid about financial irregularities. The coordinated nature of their attack made it clear that this had been planned, that Gerald had been preparing for this moment when I would finally ask too many questions and need to be discredited. The final blow came when Charlotte, her voice filled with genuine hatred, screamed that she wished I would just disappear forever because I was poisoning the family with my negativity and suspicion. Tyler echoed her sentiment, saying that everyone would be happier if I just vanished from their lives completely. Gerald nodded approvingly and added that perhaps it was time for me to find a new family since I clearly didn't appreciate the one I had been born into. What they didn't know was that I had been secretly recording the conversation on my phone from the moment Gerald started attacking my character. I had also managed to take pictures of several documents I had seen on his laptop screen while he was distracted by the confrontation. As the family continued their verbal assault, demanding that I apologize for my suspicions and promise to stop questioning Gerald's business practices, I realized that I was looking at strangers who had been using and manipulating me for their own financial gain. I stood up from the dinner table, looked each of them in the eye, and told them that their wish was about to come true. I was indeed going to disappear from their lives, but they might not be as happy about it as they thought they would be. I walked out of that house and into the Christmas Eve snowstorm, carrying with me not just the evidence I had gathered that night, but a clear understanding that my family had chosen greed over love, fraud over integrity, and Gerald over me. The snowstorm that greeted me as I left the family mansion felt appropriate for the complete upheaval of everything I had believed about my life. It was nearly 10 o'clock on Christmas Eve, and most businesses were closed, leaving me with few options for shelter or support. I drove through the empty streets, my hands shaking from both the cold and the emotional trauma of what had just happened, until I found a 24-hour diner on the outskirts of town. The Starlight Diner became my headquarters for the next several hours as I processed not just the emotional devastation of losing my family, but also the professional implications of what I had discovered. Sitting in a corner booth with endless cups of coffee, I began analyzing the photos I had taken of Gerald's laptop screen and listening to the recording I had made of the dinner conversation. What I found was even worse than I had initially suspected. The documents I had photographed showed loan applications for amounts far exceeding anything my family had ever discussed with me. There were multiple properties I had never heard of, business ventures that supposedly involved my participation, and financial statements that showed income streams that didn't exist. Most disturbing of all, every single document bore what appeared to be my signature, but I had never seen any of these papers before in my life. I called Patricia Wilson, my former supervisor and mentor, even though I knew I was disturbing her family's Christmas Eve celebration. Patricia had always been someone I could trust with sensitive professional matters, and she had often warned me about the dangers of mixing family and business relationships. When she answered the phone and heard the distress in my voice, she immediately invited me to her home, despite the late hour and the holiday. Patricia's living room became the command center for what would become the most important investigation of my career. As I showed her the evidence I had gathered, her expression grew increasingly grim. She confirmed what I had begun to suspect. The signatures on those documents were sophisticated forgeries, and the financial schemes they represented could result in serious federal charges for everyone involved. She also pointed out details that I had missed, including references to previous business partnerships and financial relationships that suggested Gerald had been planning this fraud for much longer than I had realized. The scope of the deception became clearer as Patricia helped me analyze the financial patterns revealed in the documents. Gerald had been systematically using my professional reputation and credit score to access funding for increasingly elaborate investment schemes. Some of the loans were legitimate business ventures, but others appeared to be simple cash grabs designed to fund a lifestyle that was completely unsustainable based on the family's actual income and assets. Patricia insisted that I contact Marcus Chun, a lawyer friend who specialized in white-collar crime, despite the fact that it was now past midnight on Christmas morning. Marcus was initially reluctant to discuss legal matters during the holiday, but when Patricia explained the situation and the potential scope of the fraud, he agreed to meet with us immediately. His office building was closed, so we gathered in his home office, where the gravity of the situation became even more apparent. Marcus confirmed that I was potentially facing both criminal and civil liability for loans that had been taken using my forged signature. Even though I was clearly a victim of identity theft, the fact that I had allowed Gerald access to some of my personal information and had signed legitimate documents for previous family business ventures made my situation legally complex. He emphasized that my best defense would be to cooperate fully with authorities and provide all the evidence I had gathered, but he also warned me that Gerald and my family would likely try to paint me as a willing participant who was now trying to avoid responsibility. The emotional impact of realizing that I had been completely betrayed by the people I loved most was almost overwhelming. As we worked through the legal and financial implications of the fraud, I found myself grieving not just for the family relationships I had lost, but for the naive trust one had placed in people who had been systematically exploiting me. Patricia and Marcus provided not just professional guidance, but emotional support during what was undoubtedly the worst night of my life. By dawn on Christmas morning, we had developed a preliminary strategy for exposing the fraud and protecting me from further liability. The first step would be to file reports with multiple financial institutions, alerting them to the forged documents and requesting freezes on any accounts or loans associated with my name. We also needed to contact law enforcement agencies and provide them with all the evidence I had gathered, despite the fact that doing so would almost certainly destroy what remained of my family relationships. The most difficult part of that long night was accepting that there would be no going back to the way things had been. Even if my family members were willing to acknowledge their wrongdoing and make restitution, the trust that had been broken could never be repaired. I was essentially becoming an orphan by choice, trading the illusion of family love for the reality of legal justice and personal integrity. As Christmas morning arrived, I made the first of what would be many phone calls to financial institutions, law enforcement agencies, and regulatory bodies. Each call felt like another step away from the life I had known and toward an uncertain future where I would have to rebuild everything from scratch. But it also felt like the first honest thing I had done in months, and there was a strange sense of relief in finally telling the truth about what had been happening to my family's finances. The day after Christmas, I began what would become the most thorough financial investigation of my career. Working with Patricia's guidance and Marcus's legal expertise, I systematically traced every document, every transaction, and every business relationship that Gerald had created using my identity. What we uncovered was a web of frauds so extensive and sophisticated that it took my breath away. The legitimate loans that Gerald had initially secured using my credentials had been just the beginning of an increasingly complex scheme. Over the course of 18 months, he had created multiple business entities, each one designed to access different funding sources and investment opportunities. My forged signature appeared on articles of incorporation, loan applications, insurance policies, and investment agreements for companies I had never heard of and business ventures I had never discussed. The financial records we obtained through legitimate channels revealed that Gerald had been using a technique called layering, where fraudulent transactions are disguised through multiple transfers and complex corporate structures. Money would be borrowed using my credentials for one supposedly legitimate business purpose, then transferred through a series of shell companies before ultimately being used to fund completely different ventures or simply to support Gerald and Charlotte's increasingly lavish lifestyle. One of the most disturbing discoveries was that Gerald had been doing this type of financial fraud for much longer than his relationship with our family. Court records and bankruptcy filings showed that he had previous business partnerships that had ended in litigation and criminal investigations. He had changed his name twice in the past decade and had been using various aliases to avoid detection by creditors and law enforcement agencies. My brother Tyler's role in the fraud was more extensive than I had initially realized. Bank records showed that he had been receiving regular payments from several of the fraudulent business entities, disguised as consulting fees for real estate services. He had also provided Gerald with access to my personal information, including copies of my professional licenses, credit reports, and even private correspondence that Gerald had used to create more convincing forgeries. The investigation revealed that Charlotte had not been a passive victim of Gerald's manipulation, as I had initially hoped. She had been actively participating in the fraud from the beginning, signing documents as a corporate officer for several of the shell companies and even traveling to different states to meet with lenders and investors. Her performances during these meetings were apparently so convincing that several financial institutions had increased their loan amounts based on her presentations about the family's business prospects. The scope of the fraud extended far beyond our family's immediate financial situation. Gerald had been networking with other criminals who specialized in identity theft and financial fraud, and there was evidence that my personal information had been shared with these associates for use in additional schemes. This meant that I was potentially at risk for financial crimes that I hadn't even discovered yet, and that other innocent people were likely being victimized using similar methods. The real estate investments that Gerald had made using fraudulent funding were another layer of the criminal enterprise. Properties had been purchased at inflated prices through coordinated transactions with accomplices who would then rent or sell them back to Gerald's companies at even higher prices. The artificial inflation of asset values was being used to justify additional loans and investments, creating a pyramid scheme that was destined to collapse once the fraud was discovered. Patricia's contacts in the financial industry helped us identify other professionals who had been victimized by similar schemes. We discovered a network of accountants, financial advisors, and business consultants who had been targeted by Gerald and his associates specifically because of their professional credentials and clean financial records. Some of these victims had been fighting legal battles for years, trying to clear their names and recover from the financial damage caused by identity theft. The investigation also revealed how Gerald had been able to maintain the fraud for so long without detection. He had been making timely payments on most of the fraudulent loans, using money from newer loans to service older debts. This created the appearance of legitimate business activity, while actually creating an ever-expanding web of financial obligations that would eventually require either massive legitimate income or complete disappearance to resolve. The emotional toll of uncovering the full extent of my family's betrayal was enormous. Each new document we discovered, each additional layer of fraud we exposed, felt like another confirmation that the people I had loved and trusted had been systematically destroying my life for their own financial gain. The Gerald who had seemed so caring and protective was actually a career criminal who had targeted our family specifically because of my professional credentials and trusting nature. Working 18-hour days to trace every aspect of the fraud became my way of coping with the emotional devastation. Each piece of evidence we gathered was another step toward justice, but also another step away from any possibility of reconciliation with my family. By the end of that week, we had compiled a file of evidence that was several inches thick, documenting not just the fraud that had been committed against me, but the extensive criminal enterprise that Gerald had been operating with my family's willing participation. The most heartbreaking discovery was a series of emails between Gerald, Charlotte, and Tyler discussing how to handle my growing suspicions about their business activities. These communications revealed that they had been planning to discredit me for months, developing strategies to paint me as mentally unstable or professionally incompetent if I became too curious about their financial arrangements. They had even discussed the possibility of having me involuntarily committed for psychiatric evaluation if I threatened to expose their activities. The first indication that my family had realized the seriousness of my disappearance came on December 27th, when I received a series of increasingly frantic phone calls from Charlotte. Her initial messages were attempts at reconciliation, claiming that the Christmas Eve dinner had been a misunderstanding and that everyone was worried about me. When I didn't respond to these overtures, the tone of her communications quickly shifted to threats and intimidation. Gerald's counterattack began with a systematic campaign to destroy my professional reputation. He started calling my clients, claiming to be concerned about my mental health, and suggesting that I had been exhibiting erratic behavior and making poor financial decisions. He presented himself as a caring stepfather who was trying to protect people from potentially harmful advice from someone who was clearly having a psychological breakdown. The lies Gerald told about me were sophisticated and plausible enough that several of my clients became concerned and requested meetings to discuss their accounts. He claimed that I had been stealing money from family accounts, that I had been making unauthorized investments with other people's funds, and that I had recently been hospitalized for drug addiction. Each lie was crafted to sound believable while being impossible for me to quickly disprove. Charlotte joined the character assassination campaign by contacting friends and extended family members, spreading rumors about my supposed mental instability and financial irresponsibility. She told people that I had been embezzling money from my own mother, that I had developed a gambling addiction, and that I had been making wild accusations against Gerald because I was angry about being caught stealing. Her performance as a heartbroken mother dealing with a troubled daughter was convincing enough that many people believed her stories. Tyler's contribution to the smear campaign was particularly painful because he had access to mutual friends and professional contacts that Gerald and Charlotte couldn't reach directly. He told people that I had always been jealous of the family's success and that I was now trying to destroy Gerald's reputation because I resented his relationship with our mother. He shared private information about my past relationships and financial struggles, painting a picture of someone who is unstable and vindictive. The legal intimidation began when Gerald hired a prominent law firm to send cease and desist letters to me, Patricia, and Marcus. These letters claimed that I was engaged in a malicious campaign of harassment and defamation against innocent family members, and they threatened both civil and criminal action if I continued to spread what they characterized as false accusations. The legal papers were impressive and intimidating, designed to make us question whether we had enough evidence to proceed with our own legal actions. Gerald's criminal associates became involved when the cease and desist letters failed to silence me. I began receiving anonymous phone calls threatening physical harm if I continued to pursue legal action against the family. My apartment was broken into, though nothing was stolen, in what was clearly an intimidation tactic designed to make me feel unsafe and vulnerable. Patricia's car was vandalized, and Marcus received threatening messages at his law office. The financial pressure increased when Gerald and Charlotte managed to freeze several shared family accounts, claiming that I had been making unauthorized withdrawals and that they needed to protect family assets from further theft. This action cut off my access to emergency funds that I had contributed to over the years, and it also created the appearance that there was substance to their claims about my financial irresponsibility. The social isolation campaign was perhaps the most emotionally devastating aspect of their counterattack. Extended family members who had known me my entire life began treating me as if I was a dangerous stranger, refusing to take my phone calls and blocking me on social media. Friends who had previously enjoyed family gatherings at Charlotte's house were told that I was no longer welcome and that associating with me would mean they could no longer be part of family events. Gerald's attempts to turn my professional contacts against me were initially successful because his presentation was so polished and his apparent concern for my well-being seemed genuine. He provided people with carefully selected pieces of information that made his version of events seem plausible while omitting crucial details that would have revealed his own criminal behavior. Several professional relationships that I had built over years were damaged or destroyed by his manipulation. The psychological warfare reached its peak when Charlotte showed up at my apartment building, accompanied by several family members, claiming that they were there to stage an intervention for my supposed mental health crisis. They demanded that I seek immediate psychiatric treatment and threatened to have me involuntarily committed if I refused to acknowledge that my accusations against Gerald were the result of paranoid delusions. The pressure became so intense that I began to question my own perceptions and memories, which was clearly the intended effect of their campaign. Gerald's gaslighting techniques were sophisticated enough that even with clear evidence of his fraud, I found myself wondering whether I had somehow misunderstood the situation or blown minor irregularities out of proportion. Patricia and Marcus had to constantly remind me that the evidence spoke for itself and that my family's reaction was proof of their guilt rather than my mental instability. The turning point came when Patricia Wilson publicly vouched for my professional integrity and mental health, putting her own reputation on the line to support my version of events. Her willingness to stand by me despite the potential damage to her own career provided the credibility I needed to weather Gerald's smear campaign. She also connected me with other professionals who had experienced similar attacks from white-collar criminals, helping me understand that these intimidation tactics were standard operating procedure for people caught committing financial fraud. The family's increasingly desperate attempts to discredit me actually began to work in my favor as their behavior became more extreme and obviously coordinated. People who had initially been swayed by Gerald's reasonable-sounding concerns began to notice the inconsistencies in their stories and the over-the-top nature of their attacks. The fact that an entire family was working so hard to destroy one person's credibility started to seem suspicious rather than justified. Working with forensic accountants recommended by Marcus, we began the painstaking process of documenting every fraudulent transaction and forged document that Gerald had created using my identity. The financial experts we hired specialized in white-collar crime cases and had experience testifying in federal court about complex fraud schemes. Their analysis revealed patterns and connections that I never could have identified on my own. The digital forensics investigation uncovered a treasure trove of electronic evidence that Gerald thought he had deleted or hidden. Computer specialists recovered emails, financial spreadsheets, and even practice sessions where Gerald had been perfecting his forgeries of my signature. The electronic trail showed clear intent to commit fraud and demonstrated the sophisticated planning that had gone into the criminal enterprise. One of the most valuable discoveries was a series of recorded phone conversations between Gerald and his criminal associates, discussing how to expand their identity theft operation to include other financial professionals. These recordings had been automatically backed up to cloud storage accounts that Gerald had forgotten about, and they provided direct evidence of his involvement in a much larger criminal conspiracy than we had initially suspected. The forensic accountants traced money flows through dozens of bank accounts, shell companies, and investment vehicles, creating a comprehensive map of how Gerald had been laundering the proceeds from his fraudulent loans. The analysis revealed that over $2.5 million had been stolen using my identity, with most of that money being used to fund Gerald and Charlotte's lifestyle rather than legitimate business investments. Bank cooperation was essential to building our case, and most financial institutions were eager to help once they understood the scope of the fraud. They provided detailed records of all transactions associated with my name and helped identify other accounts that might be part of the criminal scheme. Several banks also admitted that they should have caught the forgeries during their normal verification processes, which strengthened our position for potential civil recovery. The investigation attracted the attention of the FBI's white-collar crime division when the total amount of documented fraud exceeded federal thresholds for major financial crimes. Special Agent Jennifer Rodriguez was assigned to the case, and her team began conducting their own parallel investigation using resources and authorities that were not available to our private legal team. The federal involvement added credibility to our claims and increased the pressure on Gerald and his accomplices. Former employees of Gerald's various business entities began coming forward as witnesses once word spread about the federal investigation. These individuals provided insider information about how the fraud schemes operated and testified about instructions they had received to forge documents or misrepresent financial information to lenders and investors. Their willingness to cooperate was partly motivated by immunity agreements, but also by genuine regret about their participation in criminal activities. The paper trail documentation process required months of careful work to organize and authenticate all the evidence we had gathered. Every document had to be properly cataloged, verified for authenticity, and prepared for potential use in criminal or civil proceedings. The final evidence file included over 3,000 pages of financial records, forged documents, electronic communications, and witness statements. One of the most challenging aspects of building the case was proving that I had been an unwitting victim rather than a willing participant in the fraud. Gerald's lawyers were already preparing to argue that I had knowingly participated in the schemes and was now trying to avoid responsibility by claiming victimhood. We had to carefully document every instance where I had been deceived or manipulated and show that my legitimate business activities with the family were clearly separate from the fraudulent transactions. The investigation revealed that Gerald had been using similar fraud techniques for over a decade, targeting families and individuals who had good credit and professional credentials. We identified at least 6 other victims who had experienced similar identity theft and financial manipulation, and their cases provided additional evidence of Gerald's criminal pattern and methods. The personal cost of conducting such an intensive investigation was enormous. I was working virtually around the clock to help gather and organize evidence, while also trying to maintain my professional practice and deal with the emotional trauma of family betrayal. The stress took a serious toll on my physical and mental health, requiring me to seek counseling and medical care to cope with the situation. Law enforcement agencies at both state and federal levels began coordinating their investigations as the scope of Gerald's criminal activities became clear. The case expanded beyond simple identity theft and fraud to include money laundering, racketeering, and conspiracy charges that could result in decades of prison time for everyone involved. The complexity of the charges also meant that the legal process would likely take years to resolve completely. The evidence-building phase revealed not only the extent of Gerald's crimes, but also the depth of my family's betrayal. Charlotte and Tyler had not been passive victims of Gerald's manipulation. They had been active participants who had knowingly benefited from criminal activities while helping to victimize me. This realization was perhaps more painful than the financial fraud itself, because it meant that my entire family had chosen crime over love, money over integrity, and Gerald over me. The first formal legal action came in late February when federal prosecutors filed criminal charges against Gerald, Charlotte, and Tyler for conspiracy, fraud, money laundering, and identity theft. The indictments were unsealed during coordinated arrests that took place simultaneously at their homes and businesses. The shock on their faces when FBI agents read them their rights was captured by local news cameras, marking the beginning of their public humiliation. Asset forfeiture proceedings began immediately after the arrests, with federal marshals seizing the family mansion, luxury cars, jewelry, and other assets that had been purchased with fraudulent funds. Court orders froze all bank accounts associated with Gerald's business entities and prevented any further transfers of money or property that might be used to hide criminal proceeds or compensate victims. The local media coverage of the arrests was extensive because of the large amounts of money involved and the dramatic family betrayal aspects of the story. Television news reports featured footage of the seized mansion and interviews with neighbors who expressed shock about the criminal activities that had been happening in their upscale community. The publicity added another layer of humiliation for my family members, who had built their social status on their apparent wealth and success. Gerald's attempt to flee the country was thwarted when alert customs officials detained him at the airport based on the federal warrants that had been issued. He was found carrying over $50,000 in cash, multiple fake identification documents, and detailed plans for establishing new identities in countries that didn't have extradition treaties with the United States. His arrest at the airport provided additional evidence of his criminal intent and awareness of guilt. Charlotte's psychological breakdown became apparent during her first court appearance, when she appeared disheveled and confused, apparently unable to understand the serious charges against her. Her lawyer requested a psychiatric evaluation to determine her competency to stand trial, but prosecutors argued that her mental state was the result of being caught rather than genuine mental illness. The competency hearings revealed the enormous stress she was under as the reality of her situation became clear. Tyler's response to the arrests was to immediately begin cooperating with prosecutors in hopes of receiving a reduced sentence. He provided detailed information about Gerald's criminal methods and admitted his own role in the conspiracy, while trying to minimize his involvement and blame most of the criminal activity on Gerald's manipulation. His cooperation was valuable to prosecutors, but it also revealed the extent to which he had betrayed me for financial gain. The criminal proceedings uncovered additional victims who had been defrauded by Gerald and his associates using similar methods. A victim impact fund was established to help people who had suffered financial losses, and a hotline was set up for other potential victims to report their experiences. The growing number of victims demonstrated that Gerald's criminal enterprise had been even more extensive than originally suspected. Community impact became apparent as the investigation revealed that Gerald had been using local businesses and financial institutions to facilitate his fraud schemes. Several bank employees were disciplined or terminated for failing to follow proper verification procedures, and some local businesses that had unknowingly participated in money laundering activities faced regulatory sanctions. The case served as a wake-up call for the entire financial community about the sophistication of modern fraud schemes. My personal vindication came when federal prosecutors publicly acknowledged that I had been a victim of the fraud rather than a participant, and they commended my cooperation with the investigation. This official recognition helped restore my professional reputation and provided credibility that countered the smear campaign my family had conducted against me. Several clients who had been influenced by Gerald's lies apologized and resumed their business relationships with me. The pretrial proceedings dragged on for months as defense attorneys filed numerous motions challenging the evidence and seeking reduced charges for their clients. Gerald's lawyers argued that he had been engaged in legitimate but aggressive business practices rather than criminal fraud, while Charlotte's attorney maintained that she had been manipulated and controlled by Gerald throughout their relationship. The plea negotiations revealed the desperation of my family members as they faced the possibility of decades in prison. Gerald initially refused to consider any plea agreement, maintaining his innocence and claiming that I had fabricated evidence against him. Charlotte's lawyers explored various mental health defenses, while Tyler continued to provide information to prosecutors in hopes of receiving minimal prison time. The financial investigation expanded to include tax evasion charges when it became clear that none of the criminal proceeds had been properly reported to the Internal Revenue Service. This added another layer of federal charges and increased the potential penalties for all the defendants. The tax charges also created additional opportunities for asset forfeiture and victim restitution. The complexity of the criminal enterprise required extensive coordination between federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies. Task forces were established to handle different aspects of the investigation, and the case became a model for how to prosecute sophisticated white-collar crime conspiracies. Law enforcement officials used the case as a training example for other investigations of financial fraud and identity theft schemes. The emotional toll of watching my family members face criminal prosecution was unexpectedly difficult, even after everything they had done to me. Seeing Charlotte in handcuffs brought back memories of the loving mother she had been before Gerald entered our lives, and watching Tyler's cooperation with prosecutors felt like a final betrayal of whatever family bonds might have remained. The legal process forced me to confront not just their crimes, but my own grief over the loss of the family relationships I had once cherished. The criminal trial began in September, nearly 10 months after that devastating Christmas Eve dinner. Federal prosecutors had assembled an overwhelming case against all three defendants, with hundreds of documents, dozens of witnesses, and clear evidence of a conspiracy to defraud multiple financial institutions using my stolen identity. The prosecution's opening statement laid out a timeline of criminal activity that spanned over 2 years and affected numerous victims. Gerald's defense strategy was to claim that all his business activities had been legitimate and that any irregularities in documentation were the result of careless bookkeeping rather than criminal intent. His lawyers argued that ambitious business practices shouldn't be criminalized and that the government was prosecuting an entrepreneur for taking reasonable risks with family money. This defense fell apart when prosecutors presented the recorded conversations where Gerald discussed forging my signature and hiding money from authorities. Charlotte's defense focused on her alleged victimization by Gerald, claiming that she had been psychologically manipulated and controlled throughout their relationship. Her lawyers presented expert testimony about domestic abuse patterns and argued that she had been coerced into participating in criminal activities against her will. However, bank records and witness testimony clearly showed that Charlotte had been an active and willing participant who had personally benefited from the fraud proceeds. Tyler's cooperation with prosecutors meant that he testified against both Gerald and Charlotte, providing insider details about how the criminal conspiracy had operated. His testimony revealed the extent to which the family had planned and coordinated their attacks against me, including their strategy to discredit me if I discovered their criminal activities. While his cooperation helped the prosecution's case, it also demonstrated his complete betrayal of family loyalty. The prosecution's case was strengthened by testimony from other victims of Gerald's fraud schemes, who described similar patterns of identity theft and financial manipulation. These witnesses helped establish Gerald's criminal methods and showed that his targeting of my family was part of a larger pattern of predatory behavior against people with good credit and professional credentials. Expert testimony from forensic accountants traced every dollar that had been stolen using my identity, creating a clear picture of how the criminal proceeds had been used to fund Gerald and Charlotte's lifestyle. The financial analysis revealed purchases of luxury items, expensive vacations, and high-end real estate that were completely inconsistent with their legitimate income. This evidence effectively demolished their claims that they had been engaged in legitimate business activities. The jury deliberated for only 2 days before returning guilty verdicts on all major charges against all 3 defendants. Gerald was convicted on 37 counts including conspiracy, fraud, money laundering, and identity theft. Charlotte was found guilty on 28 counts, while Tyler was convicted on 19 counts related to his role in the conspiracy. The verdicts represented complete vindication for my decision to expose their criminal activities. The sentencing phase revealed the full scope of the financial damage that had been caused by their crimes. The court determined that over $2.5 million had been stolen using fraudulent documents bearing my forged signature. Additional losses to other victims and financial institutions brought the total damage to over $4 million, qualifying the case for enhanced federal penalties. Gerald received a sentence of 15 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation. He was also ordered to pay full restitution to all victims, though prosecutors acknowledged that his assets were insufficient to cover the total amount owed. His criminal conviction effectively ended any possibility that he would ever again be able to access legitimate credit or business opportunities. Charlotte was sentenced to 8 years in prison, with credit for the mental health treatment she had received while awaiting trial. Her sentence was somewhat reduced based on her cooperation during the asset forfeiture proceedings and her agreement to surrender all property that had been purchased with criminal proceeds. The judge noted that her willing participation in the conspiracy merited significant punishment despite her claims of manipulation. Tyler received the lightest sentence of 5 years in prison because of his extensive cooperation with prosecutors and his testimony against his co-conspirators. However, the judge emphasized that his betrayal of family trust and his active participation in victimizing his own sister represented serious moral failings that couldn't be excused by his cooperation. His professional licenses were also permanently revoked. The asset forfeiture proceedings resulted in the seizure and sale of the family mansion, multiple vehicles, jewelry, artwork, and other luxury items that had been purchased with stolen money. The proceeds from these sales were distributed to victims of the fraud, though the total recovery was only about 40% of the documented losses. The remaining losses were covered by insurance claims and federal victim compensation programs. My personal financial recovery included not only restitution from the criminal proceedings, but also civil settlements with several financial institutions that had failed to properly verify the forged documents. These settlements acknowledged that better verification procedures might have prevented some of the fraud, and they provided additional compensation for the damage to my credit and professional reputation. The broader community impact of the case included strengthened verification procedures at local financial institutions and increased awareness about identity theft and family fraud schemes. The case was featured in professional training programs for bank employees, financial advisors, and law enforcement personnel as an example of how sophisticated criminals can exploit family relationships and professional credentials. The completion of the criminal proceedings brought a sense of justice and closure, but it also marked the final end of any possibility of family reconciliation. Watching my mother, stepfather, and brother being led away in handcuffs was simultaneously satisfying and heartbreaking. Justice had been served, but the family I had once loved no longer existed, and the people who remained were essentially strangers who had chosen crime over love. The legal victory felt hollow at first because winning had required destroying the last remnants of my family relationships and accepting that the people I had loved most in the world had been systematically betraying me for years. The months following the sentencing were perhaps the most difficult period of the entire ordeal, as I struggled to rebuild not just my professional life, but my fundamental understanding of trust, family, and personal relationships. Professional restoration began with a systematic campaign to repair the damage that Gerald's smear tactics had caused to my client relationships and industry reputation. Patricia Wilson played a crucial role in this process, using her extensive network to spread accurate information about what had really happened and to vouch for my integrity and competence. Several clients who had been influenced by Gerald's lies not only returned but also referred new business to me as a way of making amends. The financial compensation I received from restitution and civil settlements provided the resources I needed to rebuild my life, but it also came with the responsibility to use those resources wisely. I established an emergency fund to protect against future financial disasters and invested the remaining money conservatively, having learned painful lessons about trusting others with my financial security. The money could never compensate for the emotional damage, but it did provide stability and independence. Therapy became an essential part of my healing process as I worked to understand how I had been manipulated and to develop healthier patterns for future relationships. My counselor helped me recognize that the warning signs I had missed weren't obvious character flaws on my part, but rather the sophisticated techniques that professional manipulators use to exploit people's natural trust and family loyalty. Learning about narcissistic personality patterns and financial abuse helped me understand that Gerald's targeting of our family had been calculated and predatory. Support groups for fraud victims provided connection with other people who understood the unique trauma of being betrayed by trusted family members or intimate partners. Hearing other people's stories helped me realize that my experience, while devastating, was not unique, and that recovery was possible even from the most profound betrayals. The shared experience of financial abuse created bonds with other survivors that were based on mutual understanding and genuine support. Building new relationships required learning to trust my instincts and to set appropriate boundaries with new people in my life. The trauma of family betrayal had made me hypersensitive to any signs of manipulation or dishonesty, but therapy helped me distinguish between reasonable caution and paralyzing suspicion. I gradually developed friendships with people who demonstrated genuine care and integrity over time, creating a chosen family based on shared values rather than blood relationships. Community service became an important part of my healing journey as I began speaking at conferences and training sessions about financial fraud and family abuse. Sharing my story helped other professionals recognize warning signs of identity theft and manipulation, while also providing hope to victims who were struggling with similar betrayals. The speaking engagements transformed my painful experience into something that could help prevent others from suffering similar trauma. The one-year anniversary of that terrible Christmas Eve found me celebrating the holiday with my chosen family of close friends and supportive colleagues. The contrast with the previous year was striking. Instead of being surrounded by people who were secretly plotting against me, I was with people who genuinely cared about my well-being and who had proven their loyalty through their actions during my darkest moments. The celebration was modest but authentic, based on real relationships rather than family obligation. Wisdom gained through the experience taught me that integrity isn't just about what you do when no one is watching. It's about who you choose to become when everything you thought was solid crumbles around you. The choice to expose my family's crimes had been the most difficult decision of my life, but it had also been the most important one. It had cost me my family of origin, but it had saved my integrity and opened the door to healthier relationships. The financial industry changes that resulted from my case included improved verification procedures for signature authentication and enhanced training for employees about family fraud schemes. Several major banks implemented new protocols specifically designed to catch the type of sophisticated forgeries that Gerald had used, and professional associations began offering continuing education programs about protecting clients from identity theft by family members. Personal growth from surviving such a profound betrayal included developing stronger intuition about people's motivations and becoming more skilled at recognizing manipulation tactics. The experience had been traumatic, but it had also made me more resilient and better able to help other people who were facing similar challenges. The skills I had developed during the investigation and legal proceedings had applications far beyond my own situation. The ongoing legal aftermath continued for several years as appeals were filed and civil litigation proceeded through the courts. Gerald's attempts to overturn his conviction were unsuccessful, and additional evidence continued to emerge about the full scope of his criminal enterprise. The case eventually became a landmark prosecution that influenced how similar fraud schemes are investigated and prosecuted. Looking back on the entire experience, I realized that the family who had told me they wished I would disappear had actually done me the greatest favor of my life by revealing their true nature. Their betrayal had been devastating, but their exposure had freed me from relationships that were fundamentally dishonest and harmful. The people who genuinely loved me had proven it through their actions during my crisis, while those who had only been using me had revealed themselves when their criminal activities were threatened. The final lesson I learned was that real family isn't determined by genetics or legal relationships, but by the consistent choice to love, support, and protect each other through both good times and challenges. My chosen family might be smaller than my original one, but it's built on a foundation of honesty, integrity, and genuine care that can't be shaken by external pressures or financial temptations. Christmas Eve will always be a difficult anniversary for me, but it's also become a reminder of my own strength and the importance of standing up for what's right even when the cost is enormous. Sometimes the family that wishes you disappear needs to disappear from your life instead, and sometimes the greatest gift you can give yourself is the courage to walk away from people who never deserved you in the first place. I learned that integrity isn't just about what you do when no one is watching. It's about who you choose to become when everything you thought was solid crumbles around you. And sometimes, the greatest gift you can give yourself is the courage to walk away from people who never deserved you in the first place. What would you have done if you discovered your own family had been stealing your identity for years? Have you ever had to choose between family loyalty and doing what's right? I'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible true stories of betrayal, justice, and redemption. And don't forget to share this video with someone who needs to hear that they're not alone in facing family betrayal. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that sometimes the family you choose is stronger than the family you're born into. I hope your holidays are filled with people who truly love and support you, and may you never have to face the kind of betrayal I experienced. Take care, and I'll see you in the next video.